Hello, and welcome back to Sonata She Wrote. Today, we are analyzing Mozart's 17th Piano Concerto, K453. But, before we jump into that, I want to thank the people you see on the screen right now. They have all supported me on Patreon, and if you want to get some power to choose what I analyze, get access to some of the readings I use, and other benefits, you can become a patron yourself. Now, let's get a little theoretical. Mozart's piano concertos, as a body of work, are some of his most popular pieces, so I won't get too into details about them. I'm sure you get it. It's a piano soloist and an orchestra. But K453 is a little different than Mozart's other concertos. Mozart's piano concertos were usually written for him to showcase his own skill in concert. But in the case of K453, this concerto was written to show off one of his own students, Barbara Ployer. Barbara was, like Mozart, originally from Salzburg, but studied with him in Vienna in the 1780s before she moved to Croatia with her husband. She was one of Mozart's favorite students, and she often makes favorable appearances in his letters to his father. The charming drawing of Ployer on the screen is the only likeness we have of her, and was drawn by Mozart himself. Piano concertos are a sonata type we haven't yet discussed on the channel, the type 5 sonata. The sonata types increase in complexity as the numbers increase, type 1 being the simpler sonata form without a developmental rotation, type 3 the textbook form, and type 5 is the tricky concerto form. Hepokoski and Darcy discuss the historical context for their analysis, and really, for all concerti analysis, as being related to the theorist Heinrich Koch's concept of the 7-part format. 4 ritornelli and 3 solo sections. What Hepokoski and Darcy mean by ritornelli is not that complicated. All ritornelli are tutti, but not all tutti are ritornelli. Essentially, they feel that the 4 ritornello sections common to most concerti that follow this procedure are structural and therefore in dialogue with their Baroque relatives of the same name. In many ways, the 18th century concerto form is a direct descendant of the ritornello form of Baroque concerti. I want to jump into the music, but before I do, just know that what is unusual about a Type 5 sonata is that it has both a ritornello exposition, which typically does not modulate, followed by a soloist exposition, which does modulate. In this video, we'll be discussing both the ritornello and the soloist expositions, so let's start with the primary theme. In terms of table laying for the sonata to come, what's unusual about this P theme is the tonic pedal. A pedal note, especially in the tonic, can imply a kind of static, stuck-in-the-mud feeling. Initially, the harmony barely moves at all, only to 4. It even seems to get stuck in place and not know how to continue on these 5 chords. Finally, Mozart throws us a 2/6 chord and moves to cadence, aligning this theme with the beginning of the transition. As we continue to move through the piece, you may notice that Mozart is creating a clear division of instrument groups here. The winds sometimes act with the strings, and sometimes have a mind of their own. Before we hear both the primary theme and transition, let's examine what our standard layout to this form should be. This chart is from the Type 5 Appendix in James Hepokoski's book, A Sonata Theory Handbook. You can see here the 7-part form described by Koch. We are currently in the ritornello 1 section. We're essentially expecting to hear all the parts of a sonata form, but without any modulation. Similar to the exposition of a typical sonata, this ritornello rotation is our reference point. What happens in each coming rotation will relate back to this section. Labeling can get quite complex in a Type 5 sonata, so I'll be using Hepokoski and Darcy's method, which is to label everything according to the section of the piece it arose in. If it's from Ritornello 1, it will be labeled R1 : \\. Likewise, if it's from solo 1, it will be labeled S1 : \\, and etc. This is a very typical Mozart transition. These rhythmically long melodies that open the piece are given huge amounts of energy by the repeated notes in lower voices. When we arrive at the caesura in bar 29, you can see a bit more of what I mean by Mozart's us versus them use of the strings and winds as separate entities. The winds form the material of the caesura fill all in octaves, as if trying to continue the transition. Upper winds quickly give up, but the bassoon holds on, bringing the strings back and pivoting us towards the S theme. What you may notice is unique about this S theme is its unstable neuroticism, especially when viewed in relation to the static P theme. Even if this S does have a diatonic melody, the harmony is anything but. After the initial emphasis on the third in the melody, which always creates a sense that we might be hearing a minor chord rather than major, the harmony is chock-a-block with secondary dominance. Trouble ahead, I think. Can this frantic S theme get to cadence? We made it! But what a wild ride. Surprisingly, the strings open a cadence rather quickly in the theme, but the wind section stubbornly insists that it be allowed to state the theme as well, creating an evaded PAC effect in bar 42. Following this transgression, the strings retaliate by replacing their role in the new cadence with a shocking near modulation to the flattened 6, E-flat major. Finally, Mozart pivots away from this S1.2 and presents alternating wind and string chords toward a PAC in G major. The C theme which follows seems to be partially based on the transition, but as you can see on the chart, we should now be expecting the piano to enter, likely with a brief bridge and then its own presentation of the primary theme, so the exposition can fully play out. Before we go on to the solo rotation, however, the cadence we've just heard is the R1 EEC in the tonic key. Placing structural cadences in a Type 5 sonata gets very convoluted very quickly, but the same rule we already know applies. The EEC is the first PAC that goes on to differing material. In a Type 5 sonata, however, there is an additional requirement. On page 534 of the Elements of Sonata Theory, Hepokoski and Darcy write that if any Ritornello 1 secondary theme material sounds inside a solo 1 section after what appears to be a structural cadence, it must still be considered as S. The soloist rotation typically has one or more PAC areas. Sometimes the final trill cadence is also the EEC, but in many Type 5s, the EEC might occur before that final trill cadence that leads into Ritornello 2. I know this is complex, so to summarize, remember that the referential rotation of Ritornello 1 is not outside of sonata space. Its secondary themes still count. If the solo rotation has Ritornello 1's secondary theme inside it, that is still secondary theme, and therefore cannot be after the structural cadence, the essential expository closure. After a brief measure-long bridge, the solo rotation begins. Although the strings are absent, you may notice that the winds still provide their embellishments to the theme. So often rebelling against the strings, you may notice as we continue that the winds tend to favor the soloist's side, and vice versa. The tonic pedal remains a fundamental aspect of the primary theme, and again, we get a little stuck around these 5 chords, not quite knowing how to continue. In bar 89 and 90, the soloist evades the cadential point in the ritornello rotations, creating space for both the winds, previously with only a minor role in the P theme, to state a portion of the primary theme, while it directs us towards a cadence with a miniature display episode. A display episode is a section in a concerto where the soloist shows off a bit. They don't exactly exist outside of the form, but usually they're inserted inside formal sections, making that section a little bit longer. We'll see a few more of these as the sonata continues. Before we go on, I just want to reiterate, on this page you can see both labeling methods. The winds are playing material from the Ritornello's primary theme, so they are labeled R1P. But the soloist is playing new material not found in Ritornello 1, so it is labeled S1 P1.2. So, what has changed from the referential Ritornello 1? We have an additional transition section. After opening R1TR in bar 103, the soloist introduces new material, S1 TR1.2. I've kept the TR1 and only added 0.2 because, as you can see, the winds and strings continue on with the melodic material of R1 transition 1. This section is what Hepokoski and Darcy call a sujet libre, or free subject. As our transition now is modulating rather than simply taking us to a new theme, we knew something would change, and what Mozart has done is add in another opportunity for a virtuosic display while getting us to a new medial caesura and new caesura fill, marked S1 5 HCMC, or a dominant half cadence medial caesura. This is where the soloist really shakes up the form. As you no doubt noticed, this secondary theme is completely new material, and therefore is labeled S1 Secondary Theme 1, the first new secondary theme in the Solo 1 rotation. What's really interesting about this theme is that in the first portion of the phrase, Mozart seems to be demonstrating for the orchestra how they could cadence with this new theme. These two measures, with their alternating 1 and 5 chords, are repeated by the winds, while the piano seems to say, "You can do it! You can do it!" Sensing it might be possible, the pianist rejoins the orchestra, but this stubborn flute refuses to drop down to the tonic for a PAC. Instead of cadencing in D major, we fall into a section in D minor, which marks the second transition. That's right, this is a tri-modular block. The tri-modular block, which you may remember is when an exposition has 2 medial caesuras and 2 secondary themes, while highly deformational in other sonatas, is actually a typical part of the Type 5 form and is used to highlight the relationship between the soloist and the orchestra, which is at once collaborative and competitive. If this form is following the standard layout for a Type 5, inasmuch as this complex form has any standard layout, we should see a second medial caesura which matches the Ritornello 1 rotation. This transition section also deviates from the Ritornello, so it's marked S1 TR2. The medial caesura, caesura fill, and S theme, however, are all from the Ritornello 1 rotation and are labeled as such. Even as the piano begrudgingly plays the Ritornello's secondary theme, when the winds bustle in to state the theme again, the piano still supports them, again giving them some positive affirmations on the way to cadence. Now, obviously, you can see that I've written EEC here, and I'll just let you know, this isn't a trap. I believe this PAC is the essential expositional closure. However, in this rotation, we're going to see 2 more perfect authentic cadences. None of these cadences give way to more secondary theme, however, either the soloist theme or the Ritornello-esque theme. What they do is give us rhetorically charged cadential repetition. I mentioned a trill cadence earlier. The trill cadence is an almost essential part of the classical concerto, and, in the exposition, serves as a bit of foreshadowing for the upcoming cadenza in the recap. Mozart gives us 2 of these cadenzas. The first, tentative and missing the bass voice in the piano, and the second, stronger with a full bar of trill in the piano. If we look at the chart for a Type 5 sonata form, we're really in very good shape. Although we had a tri-modular block and a bit of a dicey moment with a dip into D minor, we reached the essential expositional closure, and the trill cadence passed off our rotation into Ritornello 2. This has been part 1 of an analysis of Mozart's 17th Piano Concerto in Type 5 sonata form. Be sure to check out part 2 for Ritornello and Solo 2, Ritornello 3, Solo 3, and our discussion of Ritornello 4 and the cadenza.